This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 43 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, December 1st, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. The last historical episode that we had was a discussion with the Mormon historian John Hamer. He offered some much-needed perspective and helped to contextualize some of the history that we've been studying recently. Well, today we're going to dive right back into the timeline. So let's get a little bit of a refresher of what happened on the last historical timeline episode so we can kind of just pick up where we left off. So last timeline episode, that was episode 41, covered from January to March of 1838. And it spanned 3 separate locations during that small time frame. The very first location, of course, was the church in Kirtland, from where Joe and Rigdon and Brigham Young had just fled in the middle of the night to avoid detection. The church in Kirtland was amidst turmoil. Joseph Coe, Cyrus Smalling, and Martin Harris had created their own Church of Christ, while Warren Parrish had led an armed insurrection that pulled away his closest members from the church. There were a small number of other break-off factions that had begun and started up and kicked off out of the insurrection that was going on in Kirtland. The second setting, of course, was Joe and Rigdon's journey with their families to Missouri during the worst absolute possible time of winter. It's just terrible. Some of the stories that came out of this journey from Kirtland to Missouri in January are just terrible, heart-wrenching stories because it was tough. It was really tough to get through the cold and the snow and the rivers, fording the frozen rivers and whatnot. I think they just made people stronger back then. And then we have, of course, the third setting, and that would be Far West Missouri. The church leadership, they were pretty much holding their own purge out in Missouri. Prominent members, including the Whitmers and Ollie Cowdung and many others, had their memberships either revoked or put on hold until the prophet could come into town to determine his truthful followers from the untrustworthy followers. So that does it for the milk of today's episode. So let's just jump right into the meat and continue talking about this goddamn train wreck. Now, I know at the end of last episode I said this week's episode would be a discussion. Well, turns out that discussion is a lot longer than I expected it to be, and it's going to be a full episode in and of itself. That'll be next week's episode. Turns out Lindsay Hansen Park of Feminist Mormon Housewives was just far too interesting to relegate to a small portion of a single episode. She deserves her own episode. So next week, that's what we'll be talking about. But let's get into this week because there's so much going on and I don't even really know where to start here. Now, what I mean is the church at this time in 1838, Missouri, essentially, that's where we're focusing, is, there's so much going on. It's really hard to decide where to kind of pick up and what to focus on, what to talk about. So let's begin with Joseph arriving at Far West. That happened on March 14th, 1838. And then, of course, Sidney Rigdon arrived April 4th, 1838. So this is how long it took them each to get from Kirtland to Missouri. And once they got to Missouri, they decided to really have a tribunal to see who would be trustworthy. Who were the members that we could trust in Far West? Because the church in Kirtland had held its own excommunication, essentially, and they had excommunicated Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith. So the leadership, essentially, of Kirtland had been excommunicated, and they were fleeing to Missouri. And there, they were going to hold their own sort of tribunal to say, we are the leadership here, and anybody that agrees with us can stay. If you do not agree, you are welcome to leave. And what happened was a series of events that are quite telling in and of themselves. Let's talk about Oliver Cowdery for a second. This guy, Ollie has been with us for such a long time. He's been a very important piece of the puzzle for the entirety of the church, essentially. If not for Oliver Cowdery, the Book of Mormon never would have been written down. The original and printer's manuscript never would have come to fruition. The Book of Mormon itself would not have arisen, if not for our good friend Ollie. And there were some tensions between him and Joseph at this time. Now, when we say tensions, we can mean any number of things, and it's really hard to understand exactly how their relationship dynamic played out at this time. But what we can do is look at letters and exchanges that were happening between Oliver Cowdery and other people at this time to see what their opinions essentially were. But Ollie, in some ways, I've seen him as almost a reality check for Joe. When Joe would have fantastical dreams about doing something, it seems like Ollie would be the person that would translate that into reality. Whether it was saying, we need a printing press and we need you to start publishing a monthly journal or, a monthly newspaper. Ollie makes it happen. We're going to found a bank and we need our own money. Ollie goes and, he gets the plates and then he prints the $5 million in cash. Whenever Joe has some fantastical wish, Ollie seems to be the person that translates that to making it happen. Or he will say, Joe, we can't do this. And this is a time when I think his ability to say, Joe, we can't do this, finally overcame his ability to saying, yes, sir, let's do it. Ollie at this time was very frustrated with Joe's intermingling of church and state. Essentially, Joe was using the church as his own legal body that was handling and transacting legal matters. They were holding ecclesiastical tribunals in place of actual legitimate legal lawsuits and trials. Ollie was part of this movement that I think he had a fundamental disagreement with at a very base level. It'd say, I don't think that the church should have authority beyond just ecclesiastical affairs. The church should only be able to control what happens in the church. There shouldn't be a thick wall of separation between church and state. Of course, this is from the minutes of the January 1838 letter, and then it's all out of the Oliver Cowdery letter book. And he says, Ollie says he was concerned that they were, quote, endeavoring to unite ecclesiastical with civil authority and force men under a pretense of incurring the displeasure of heaven to use their earthly substance contrary to their own interest, end quote. So when Joseph would say, like to William Wines Phelps, hey, I have these plots of land that I want to sell you, and it is the Lord's will that you buy them. And then, of course, Double-Dub buys those plots at a dramatically inflated rate, and then Joe holds him to that debt. As soon as Joe says that it is the will of God that you buy these plots of land, that's a big problem. Okay, that's the point where ecclesiastical authority is influencing secular transactions. And Ollie had a problem with it. So upon Joe's arrival, this is when things really become, I would say, confusing and frustrating for certain members of the church. When he arrived, we have this coming out, and it is a letter by David Whitmer, D-Day David, W.W. Phelps, Double Dub, and then John Whitmer, John Goebbels Whitmer. And Oliver Cowdery was clerk of the High Council at the time, so he was a person who attested to it being a true copy and everything. But this is the body of the complaint, and this is an actual legal complaint that these people were filing against Joseph at the time. Quote, "Sir, it is contrary to the principles of the revelations of Jesus Christ and his gospel and the laws of the land to try a person for an offense by an illegal tribunal or by men prejudiced against him or by authority that has given an opinion or decision beforehand or in his absence. Very respectfully, we have the honor to be David Whitmer, William Wines Phelps, John Whitmer, presidents of the Church of Christ in Missouri." End quote. That's where we see the frustration coming in. These people were following Joseph Smith because he was the prophet, but then he was coming along and saying, I'm also the civil leader in the area. I'm also the mayor of Far West. I'm also the person who handles all legal tribunals. I am the judge of the area. I handle any legal complaints that you have. And as soon as all of those are united into one person, it's tyranny. And of course, one thing that we cannot ignore at this time when it comes to Oliver Cowdery's relationship with Joseph Smith was Fanny Alger. Okay. The Fanny Alger affair had happened, as best as we can tell, 1836 is when it was, when it was discovered, when Emma actually discovered Joe and Fanny fucking in the barn behind the house. That's when we see this come out, 1836. Right now what we're discussing is barely 2 years and not quite 2 years after that supposedly happened. And it served to be a sticking point, a burr in the relationship between Ollie and Joe. And we see that come out in Ollie's letter to his brother Warren A. Cowdery in January of the year, calling the Fanny Alger incident a dirty, nasty, filthy scrape. And that scrape was later written over with the word affair. Ollie had a problem with Joe's incessant attraction to women. I mean, Ollie was violently opposed to polygamy all of his years. He would never join a sect of Mormonism that was affiliated with polygamy. He had his own opinions about the way women should be treated in the church, and I think that they were much more fair-minded than Joseph. Joe just liked to do what he liked to do at the expense of whoever or whatever. It didn't seem to matter much to him. But Ollie was much more sensible in some cases. He seems like he was able to disconnect himself from it and say, this is obviously not of God if Joe is claiming that, God told me that it was okay that I was fucking these women. And Ollie had a huge problem with that. Ollie and Joe did not see eye to eye on this, and it was a fundamental point of disagreement in their friendship that I think probably served as a main pressure against their friendship. And it served as one of the main driving factors that pushed Ollie away from the church. So finally, at the end of March, there's a tribunal held. And essentially, the Whitmers and William Wines Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, and Lyman Johnson, and a small number of other dissenters are excommunicated. Now, excommunicated, this is kind of a tough way to say it, because some of them were, some of them weren't, some of them were just disfellowshipped or had their membership removed. It was kind of a messy time. But in April at this time, Oliver Cowdery wrote his own letter of defection to Joseph. And it reads in part, quote, "This attempt to control me in my temporal interests I conceive to be a disposition to take from me a portion of my constitutional privileges and inherent rights. I only respectfully ask leave, therefore, to withdraw from a society assuming they have such right." End quote. And that was the problem. Cowdery saw this as an attempt to control him, to take away from me my constitutional privileges and inherent rights. Ollie saw the writing on the wall. He knew that Joseph wasn't going to stop doing what he was doing. He knew that Joe was going to go off the rails soon. And he was smart enough to jump ship before that happened. And this happened. In this horrible time of turmoil, when Joe and Rigdon come back, they have to decide who is going to be their new leadership. Because we had the presidency of the Missouri Church, who were D-Day David Whitmer, John Goebbels Whitmer, Double Dub Phelps, and then, of course, Ollie Cowdung, who was clerk. These people were the head of the church in Missouri. And then Joe and Rigdon come in from Kirtland, having been excommunicated from the church out there, and say, we're putting in our own presidency. We're going to reorganize everything out here so we know who we can trust. That's what happened. A purging, a cleansing of the leadership in Missouri. And Joe never looked back. Now, we have a very tumultuous time in Missouri here, because Far West was essentially the main settlement where Mormons were settling in Missouri. It was the central hub, but there were small other cities that were being cultivated. DeWitt was one of them. We'll get into talking about those probably the next episode or in the next few episodes, but at this time, Far West Missouri was the focus. This was the point where they were establishing the church. The church presidency in Missouri had been residing in Far West for a couple of years by this point, but they decided that this is going to be the new headquarters, essentially. And with these people that had dissented, these people that had fallen away, these very important individuals in the timeline had essentially left. David Whitmer, John Whitmer, Ollie Cowdung, these people had all resigned or been excommunicated from the church by the middle of May 1838. In fact, it wasn't just them. Here's a list of people that were excommunicated by May of 1838. We have Martin Harris, David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, John Whitmer. We talked about them. We also have Jacob Whitmer and Hiram Page. Hiram Page, who gave his own personal revelation about where Zion is, and Joe had his seer stone crushed and turned into powder. Then we have William E. McClellan, Professor Bill. Then we have Luke Johnson, Lyman, Leadfoot, Lyman E. Johnson, John F. Boynton, W.W. Phelps, William Bynes Phelps, we knew about him. Then Frederick G. Williams, Freddie G. William. Those are just some of the most prominent members in the leadership. I mean, those were people that were Quorum of the 12. 6 of those people were Book of Mormon witnesses. I mean, 6 of the 11 Book of Mormon witnesses were all excommunicated. That's absolutely absurd. The first presidency of the church, the Whitmers and Phelps, they were the presidents in Missouri. They were all gone. I mean, how the hell does a church recover from this? You just cleansed out half of the people that run the church in Missouri and replace them with people you think you can trust. How does the church survive? By demonizing these people. Don't get me wrong, Ollie and the Whitmers had good reasons to be fighting Joe. I mean, Joe was overstepping serious boundaries. He was intermingling church and state authority to the point that there was no line separating the two. Joe was the leader of Far West. And Ollie and the Whitmers had good arguments against him. That we shouldn't intermingle church and state. That he had been fucking over people with the Kirtland Safety Society investments. That he had been fucking Fanny Alger a couple of years ago, and that was adultery, not conduct befitting of a proper prophet of the Lord. So Sidney Rigdon helps insulate Joe. Now, this is my own perspective. This is how I'm looking back and seeing it here, but I feel like Rigdon began to take very drastic steps in a way that would insulate Joseph away from these people that were real dissenters, people that were causing serious problems for the church, that were, even publishing like public discourses and public letters to the church. That one that we just read that was signed David Whitmer, Phelps, and John Whitmer. It's contrary to the principles and revelations of Jesus and his gospel for the laws of the land to be intermingled, blah, blah, blah. That was an open letter that was published publicly. People in Missouri saw and read that letter. And, well, they still had good arguments. Now, of course, at this time, the Danites were not really organized because they had been organized, a few months before this. But the Danites began to be used at this point. They began to become very convenient, very useful at this point. I think this marks a turning point in our history. I gave D-Day David Whitmer a nickname nearly 2 years ago when he was introduced into the show. D-Day David Whitmer. It stands for Defection Day. And while we can't sum all of these people leaving up in one day, I think we can point to one small catalyst that can be seen as the single point where defection was the only answer. Defection or agreement. You can either fall into line behind Joe and Rigdon, or, horribly enough, you can dissent. And who knows what happens once you dissent. Well, Sidney Rigdon knew what would happen. So on June 17th, 1838, and I think this is where Rigdon becomes the psychotic firebrand that he's been hinting at for so long. I think this is the point where we can say this is Defection Day, and this is the single point that required Defection Day to happen. And Defection Day happened 3 days after this salt sermon was given. But this is one of Rigdon's most well-known and influential speeches. And it was different from Rigdon's many other speeches in the sense that it was proofread. They had written it out before he got up on the stand, as opposed to most of his other sermons were just him standing up and talking. The salt sermon was published. It was they proofread it before he went on the stage. Then he gave it, and then they published it and sold it for I'm not sure. I think 37 cents a copy or something. A quarter and a shilling per copy. Now, there unfortunately aren't any full copies left in existence of the Salt Sermon, but we do have quite a few accounts of people that discuss the contents of it. This is taken from John Correll's A Brief History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, talking about it. President Rigdon delivered from the pulpit what I call the Salt Sermon. Now, this is quoting the Salt Sermon itself. Quote, "If the salt have lost its savor, it is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the feet of men." Now, that's the end of the Salt Sermon, but I'm going to continue quoting John Correll here. quote, was his text, and although he did not call names in his sermon, yet it was plainly understood that he meant the dissenters, or those who denied the faith, ought to be cast out and literally trodden underfoot. He indirectly accused some of them with crime, end quote. That's what happened. The salt sermon, that these people should be cast out and trodden underfoot of men, because the salt has lost its savor. It's thenceforth good for nothing. Now, of course, he took that from Matthew 5, but he built an entire sermon on it, and it was a 2-hour long sermon that blew people's minds, and it scared the dissenters. It made people truly afraid for their lives. Now, 2 days after that, 2 days after the salt sermon was given, Ollie Cowdung, Leadfoot Lyman Johnson, D-Day David, and John Goebbels Whitmer fled far west, headed for Richmond, Missouri. They ran the fuck away because that's how scary this was. I mean, the Danites had been threatening them. There had been various amorphous death threats up to this point, but finally Sidney Rigdon got on the stand and gave this salt sermon in June 17th, 1838, and said, the salt that has lost its sermon, meaning the dissenters, will be trodden underfoot. I would be terrified if I were these people. I would run so fast. This is horrifying to see this. And what is absolutely insane is the fact that Rigdon ramped it up after this. The salt sermon was just the beginning. The salt sermon was only dealing with dissenters in Far West, trying to get them out, chase them out. But on July 4th, holy shit, Sidney Rigdon gave his July 4th oration. And people know about the salt sermon. And the salt sermon is powerful, but it only deals with dissent and people that were living in Far West. But the 4th of July oration was given to everybody. It was widely published as well, and we still have many copies of it still existing. It was printed out of Far West as well. Now, I'm going to read this whole thing because it's fucking amazing. There's no possible way that we can understand Sidney Rigdon more than by just reading through this 4th of July oration. Now, if you support the show through patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you're about to listen to the entire sermon, the entire 4th of July oration. For those that do not subscribe to Patreon, you're about to hear just a couple of intense excerpts taken out of it. But the discussion afterwards will still be the same, but please listen at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If you contribute there, this episode is going to be a little bit longer. You will be able to listen to the entire oration, and I really recommend it because, my God, this guy was terrifying, absolutely scary to have a person preaching this from the pulpit. This is taken from the BYU library, online library, and it is a photocopy. I'm reading it from a photocopy of the oration, and this was printed in 1838. There will be a link for it on the show notes as a PDF of the actual speech as they were printed and distributed, about 12 pages long. It's huge, way bigger than I thought it was. So if you are a Patreon subscriber, you're going to get a lot more than what the normal listeners get to the show. So I hope that you share in the enlightenment and enjoy it as much as I enjoyed reading it myself. Quote, all right, this is where it gets fucking insane. This is when it ramps up. And of course it has to be for the final portion of the speech. 'Cause holy shit, if he was getting the crowd riled up as Rigdon was wont to do, this was the time when he really brought this to an ultimate crescendo. And I can't imagine that right now his dick could have become any harder than it was, because this is exactly what Rigdon was made for. This is why Rigdon is the best preacher in all of Mormonism history. The most amazing preacher. Here we go. Our God has promised us a reward of eternal inheritance, and we have believed his promise. And though we wade through great tribulation, we are in nothing discouraged, for we know he that has promised is faithful. The promise is sure, and the reward is certain. It is because of this that we have taken the spoiling of our goods. Our cheeks have been given to the smiters, and our heads to those who have plucked off the hair. We have not only when smitten on one cheek turned to the other, but we have done it again and again, until we are wearied of being smitten and tired of being trampled upon. We have proved the world with kindness. We have suffered their abuse without cause, with patience, and have endured without resentment, until this day, and their persecutions and violence does not cease. But from this day and this hour, we will suffer it no more. We take God and all the holy angels to witness this day, that we warn all men in the name of Jesus Christ to come on us no more forever. For from this hour we will bear it no more. Our rights shall no more be trampled on with impunity. The man or set of men who attempts it does it at the expense of their lives. And that mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination. For we will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seat of war to their own houses and their own families, and one party or the other shall be utterly destroyed. Remember it then, all men. We will never be the aggressors. We will infringe on the rights of no people, but shall stand for our own until death. We claim our own rights, and are willing that all others shall enjoy theirs. No man shall be at liberty to come into our streets to threaten us with mobs, for if he does, he shall atone for it before he leaves this place. Neither shall he be at liberty to vilify and slander any of us, for suffer it we will not in this place. We, therefore, take all men to record this day, that we proclaim our liberty on this day as did our fathers. We pledge this day to one another our fortunes, our lives, and our sacred honors, to be delivered from the persecutions which we have had to endure for the last 9 years. Neither will we indulge any man or set of men in instituting vexatious lawsuits against us, to cheat us out of our just rights. If they attempt it, we say, woe be unto them. We this day then proclaim ourselves free, with a purpose and a determination that can never be broken. No, never. No, never. No, never. End quote. The people in Missouri hated the Mormons for this. This is a quote from Ebenezer Robinson, included in Items of Personal History of the Editor, published in November of 1889. Of course, Ebenezer Robinson at the time was a printer in Far West. It said, quote, "A copy of the oration was furnished to the editor and printed in the Far West, a weekly newspaper printed in Liberty, the county seat of Clay County. It was also printed in pamphlet form by the writer of this in the printing office of the Elders Journal in the city of Far West, a copy of which we have preserved. This oration and the stand taken by the church in endorsing it and its publication undoubtedly exerted a powerful influence in arousing the people of the whole upper Missouri country." End quote. I think this was a turning point. Before now, the Missourians didn't like Mormons. They were frustrated by what the Mormons had done and by some of their bullshit business practices, their land speculation. You know, they didn't really like the Mormons. The Missourians and the Mormons were just not very friendly to each other. But this is the point when they became hostile. This is when they went from not liking the Mormons to, holy shit, we got a serious problem in parts of Missouri. The Mormons are really becoming a problem now. We have a Mormon standing up in front of a congregation of a few thousand people saying, "We will have a war of extermination between us and the Missourians. We'll follow them to their homes and their families, and every drop of their blood will be spilled." Now, just consider the possibility of this. I've used this example before, but let's just say, Abu Bashar Baghdadi, or somebody with a very, foreign name to Americans, moves to one of the plain states, Iowa or Kansas or one of those places that has just nothing. There's nothing out there. Just grassland and cornfields and nuclear missile silos. Just nothing out there. Absolutely nothing useful. And then this Abu person begins to amass a following. It starts out just him and a couple of his friends, and then they bring in a couple more of their friends and all of their friends' families and their own families. And then all of their friends start bringing in their extended relatives and their family and their other friends. And eventually you have an entire swath of 2,000 or 3,000 people with names like Muhammad and Abu and Bakr and whatever, scary foreign names that so many Americans are scared of at the time. What if Abu stands up on the stand and says, "We will kill all of the Kansasans or all of the Missourians or all of the Iowans for persecuting us. We will follow them to their homes, to their families, and spill every last drop of their blood. We will have a war of extermination between us and them." How would people react today? How long until that little commune of, this religious commune would be surrounded by tanks, right? How long until something like that would happen? Or they just drone strike the area. Oh, well, it's our, they're drone striking American soil. Oh, well, the people are brown and they have weird names, so it's okay. As long as they aren't white Americans on American soil, we can bomb them. We can do whatever we want to them. Like, this is simply scary to think about, because it's entirely possible that it could happen. Now, if somebody stands up on the stand and gives a sermon like this and nothing happens, I'm not bothered by it. I'm bothered by the fact that it furthers a bullshit persecution narrative, but I'm not bothered by the fact that it didn't go anywhere. In fact, I'm happy that it didn't go anywhere. However, if somebody gets up on a stand and talks like this, And then a few months later, there are rumors going around of fights and brawls and mobs gathering together and fighting and shooting guns at each other. You know, things at this point are escalating, and there's no happy de-escalation in sight. There's no way to knock off the level of escalation that has already happened. And Rigdon saw it necessary to blow this shit out of proportion, to go absolutely apeshit insane with this. Now, as I said earlier, the Missourians didn't really hate the Mormons before this. They were more of an inconvenience and a frustration, and those people that believe in the wacky golden Bible and are destitute and poor and drive down real estate values when they go to an area. That's all the Mormons were to the Missourians until this sermon was given. Until this sermon was not only given, but it was widely published and sold and reprinted in newspapers, and it gained traction. This speech went viral because it was that fucking terrifying to have somebody like Sidney Rigdon or Joseph Smith standing up, leading a few thousand people in saying, "We will exterminate those who persecute us." That's fucking terrifying. And how would we react today? I mean, there's no real analog to it that we can think of, is there? I mean, there's no proper analog to this. And given some of the Danite actions that follow in the coming months after this sermon was given, the people were right to be terrified. Joe was using the Danites as his own little personal muscle squad. We'll have to get into this later just because it's so fascinating. But this marks the beginning of the vilification of the Mormons in Missouri. The beginning of when the Missourians said, "We really cannot deal with the Mormons right now. They really are an actual problem." This is from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. It's a book by Stephen C. LeSueur on page 52. Quote, "Most Missourians were not aware of any unusual strain in their relations with the Mormons. Many believed that interaction between the two groups had become remarkably friendly. Rigdon's warnings therefore surprised and alarmed Missouri settlers who interpreted the speech as an open, defiant declaration of Mormon intentions to set themselves outside the law." Now he is quoting from the Liberty Western Star. It was published September 14th, 1838, and it was reprinted in the Missouri Argus September 27th, 1838. This is a direct quote from the book, 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, quote, "Until the 4th of July, we heard of no threats being made against them in any quarter. The people had all become reconciled to let them remain where they are, and indeed were disposed to lend them a helping hand. But one Sidney Rigdon, in order to show himself off as a great man, collected them all together in the town of Far West on the 4th of July, and there delivered a speech containing the essence of, if not treason itself. This speech was not only published in the newspapers, but handbills were struck for distribution in Caldwell and Daviess counties. We have not the speech now before us, but we recollect among other threats that this author said, 'We will not suffer any vexatious lawsuits against our people, nor will we suffer any person to come into our streets and abuse them.' Now, if this is not a manifestation of a disposition to prevent the force of law, we do not know what is." End quote. Seriously, if not for Rigdon's little bullshit 4th of July sermon, things would have gone completely different for the Mormons in Missouri. There wouldn't have been a Missouri and Mormon War, no Liberty Jail, no, possibly being reinstated to Jackson County, that whole idea just flying out the window. I mean, we can point to this one fuck up by Rigdon and say that things would have been drastically different if he wouldn't have escalated the situation. Thanks to Rigdon's salt sermon and his 4th of July sermon, and I guess what you could call like the butterfly effect or something, American history is forever how it is now, thanks to Sidney Rigdon. Yeah. Who knows how things would have played out, how the history would have played out if Rigdon wouldn't have given the speech. There's no possible way to ascertain what would have happened, right? But this was an important speech because it set out the lines in the sand. It said, "We are the Mormons. We will not endure any persecution. Anybody that is trying to persecute us will meet their death," essentially. That's goddamn terrifying. Now, it wasn't just this preaching that Rigdon had done. It was an amalgamation of so many things. Because once Joe and Rigdon got to Missouri, they turned their ideas of aggressive expansion towards DeWitt and towards the church that was just anywhere in Missouri at the time. They figured, we got chased out of Kirtland. Let's not let that happen again. Let's establish a stable stronghold here, and let's branch out to as many local areas as we possibly can so that we kind of decentralize the power, essentially, so that we can have many places that can be possible strongholds, because that's why Joe and Rigdon went to Missouri in the first place. Why they fled to Far West in the first place was because Kirtland was no longer safe from both legal prosecution and internal dissent. The number of members that were trying to take the church from Joe was astronomical. So they were running from that, essentially, as well as from other lawsuits that were going on. Of course, which ended up with the schoolhouse, the 3-story church building in Kirtland falling into the possession of Grandison Newell and it being burned down by Lyman Sherman in January of 38. We talked about that a couple episodes back. But there were so many other problems that the Saints were having and that even the Missourians were having with Joe and Rigdon. This is from the autobiography of Ebenezer Robinson. It says, quote, "On May 12, 1838, Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon went before the High Council to appeal for financial assistance in remuneration for their services to the church, being reduced, as it were, to beggary as a result." Yeah, well, of course, they had just fled from Kirtland, all of their possessions and everything they owned. Joe and Rigdon were just as destitute as most of the members of the church. The council, upon considering their request, instructed the bishop to provide for each of them an 80-acre lot of church property. So just handed them 80 acres. And appointed a committee of 3 to work out with President Smith and Rigdon proper remuneration. Not for preaching or for receiving the word of God by revelation, neither for instructing the saints in righteousness, but for services rendered in the printing establishment and translating the ancient records, etc. End quote. Now, I'm going to read another line from that in a second, but that's essentially what they were saying. We need money. We need some of that internet money. Rigdon and Joe were extremely poor at this time. Not only that, but they were under an immense mountain of debt. I mean, the church hadn't been incorporated, so all of the church debts were in Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's name. Today, they would owe about, $1.3, $1.5 million in today's money. And that was just personal debt that Joe and Rigdon had accumulated. Now, that's what they were trying to say. Well, we need some money. Because not only are we really poor, we don't have enough money to buy anything, but we're also a lot of money in debt right now. So please help us out. But, of course, being as violently opposed to priestcraft as Joe and as Mormonism in general is, they had to find a way around it. They said, we're not getting this money for preaching or for receiving the word of God or for instructing the saints in righteousness. Instead, we are only receiving it for services rendered in printing these things and in translating the ancient records. That's it. That's the only reason that they had for this remuneration. Now, if you're going to be a preacher in a local area, say it. I'm a preacher. I don't have enough time to have a day job. Therefore, give me money. Like, that's very simple. Most preachers do that. They're just full-time ministers. But Joe and Rigdon couldn't do that because they had ensconced priestcrafting as being so evil and viciously of the devil in the Book of Mormon and in many of their prints before now. So they always had to find some way around it, and that's how they tried to do this. But Ebenezer Robinson goes on to detail what they decided here. It says, quote, "The above-named committee reported to the High Council at a subsequent meeting, but the sum agreed upon is left blank in the history as printed. The amount they asked for was, wait for it, $1,100 each per year." Wow, $1,100 per year. Now, at rates of inflation, that was a fairly exorbitant amount of money. I mean, very few people made more than $1 or $2 a day, but Rigdon and Joe were saying, give us $3 a day for every day of the year, essentially, to get us up to that $1,100. That's horrifying. That's an insane amount of money. Robinson, let me read the next paragraph in Robinson's autobiography because it really is amazing. Please look at this thing in the show notes because it's a great autobiography. It's really beautiful. And he discusses a lot of these things from a first person account, and that's what this is. Quote, "The question was hotly, I would think, discussed by the members of the council until near sundown. George M. Hinkle bitterly opposed it, as the church had always been opposed to a salaried minister." Yep, priestcraft, there you go. "A majority of the council, however, favored the measure, so that when the vote was called, 11 voted for it and 1 against. But when it was noised abroad that the council had taken such a step, the members of the church, almost to a man, lifted their voices against it. The expression of disapprobation was so strong and emphatic that at the next meeting of the High Council, the resolution voting them a salary was rescinded." Holy shit. End quote. So they called for this $1,100 a year. The church passed it, or the leadership, the Quorum of the 12 that had been reestablished out in Missouri, said, "We'll give it to you." But George M. Hinkle was bitterly opposed to it the whole time. He was the one that dissented. And then as soon as everybody else caught word of it, that Rigdon and Joe were getting $1,100 salary for being the preachers of the church, people lost their shit. They just lost their fucking minds. Because how can you claim to be a pious, holy prophet leading a church railing against priestcraft when you're asking for $1,100 to rescue you out of the clutches of your own shitty business practices? Like, that's absolutely absurd. And tack onto this, the church gave each of them an 80-acre lot out of the church property holdings. I mean, I understand the church wasn't incorporated at this time. It was all still under the name of Smith and Rigdon, but like, still, that 80 acres, that was church property, and they're just like, we're giving each of you 80 acres and $1,100 per year. I can't imagine that people took this too well, especially with the church in the financial dire straits it was experiencing at the time. But of course, as we all know, when somebody like Joe or Rigdon takes a step too far forward, they'll just take one step back and say, "Sorry, we're good." They rescinded that remuneration. But that doesn't say anything about the last 9 steps that they took forward before they took that one step that was over the boundaries. And this was one point that caused frustration with the Missourians, with the Mormons living in Missouri, against the leadership of the church. So we have the Salt Sermon and the 4th of July oration that are riling people up. Then we have Joe and Rigdon asking for money when they're extremely destitute. That's riling even more people up. Now we run into another set of problems that the Missourians had with the Mormons. This is taken once again out of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur. Quote, "The Mormons quickly became the dominant political force in the county." Now this is talking about Daviess County, by the way. By August, they numbered about 1/2 of the 2,000 county residents and represented at least 1/3 of the voting population. There's a problem. Most of the Mormons belonged to the Democratic Party, but they would vote for any candidate who they believed would protect their rights. They also tended to vote as a bloc and therefore held the balance of power in the Daviess election. The state and county elections scheduled for August 6th stirred considerable excitement among the Daviess settlers because it would be their first opportunity to elect their own county officers. Few Mormons ran for office, so the candidates visited Diamond frequently. So Diamond was the settlement in Daviess County, and it was essentially where Joe said that Adam and Eve fled to after they were chased out of the Garden of Eden. That was, of course, in Jackson County. They fled to Diamond. So that's Diamond in Daviess County. Anyway, a few Mormons ran for the office, so the candidates visited Diamond frequently, making promises and soliciting votes. The candidates focused their attention on Lyman Wight, who we know as General Lyman Wight from the 1834 Zion's Camp, who is considered the most influential Mormon at Diamond. Okay, so the population statistics. The Mormons were finally becoming enough of a problem in Missouri that the Missourians were losing voting power. And that is a big problem. When you talk about anybody's ability to be American, their American duty is to vote for representatives they feel will take care of and represent and address their concerns. That's the most American goddamn thing you can do is vote, right? People, vote. That's all you have to do. Just fucking vote. It's not that hard. But when somebody's ability to vote becomes threatened by the Missourians or by the Mormons coming in, they take notice. When there are enough Mormons living in an area that they can sway an election for a Democrat or for a Whig or for just anybody that goes to the Mormons and said, I have your interests in mind, please vote for me, the Mormons voted for that person as a bloc. They represented almost 1/3 of the voting populace. They were almost 1/2 of the entire population in Daviess County. Like, there were enough Mormons living in the area that the Missourians had to take notice at this. And finally, when the Mormons come in and, let's say you're a Missourian Whig, you didn't agree with Andrew Jackson, you don't like Van Buren, you just don't like Democrats, you're a Whig through and through, blue-blooded Whig, whatever. You have a whole bunch of people moving in in less than a year's time, and they are enough people that your horse isn't going to win the race anymore. Your representative is no longer going to be elected to their office to represent your frustrations. As soon as that happens, that's like, that is a catalyst indicative of so many strong political pressures that were pushing on the Mormons and the Missourians. I mean, I say pushing on the Mormons, but like, they were pushing back and forth against each other. The Mormons, the native Missourians, and the Mormons. They were constantly butting heads, and this is where we see problems arising. Because, of course, 1838 being an election year, as is every 2 years, people wanted to feel like they were properly represented. The Mormons wanted to feel like they'd vote somebody in that would take care of them, and the Missourians wanted to vote somebody in who wouldn't be sympathetic to those goddamn Mormons that are destroying their land, property values, and, well, essentially creating a monopoly in DeWitt and in other places in Missouri that were, purely Mormon settlements, essentially. Now, if you listen to the John Hamer interview episode, we covered a lot of the history that I'm discussing right now. If you listen to the Sidney Rigdon presentation episode that I gave at Sunstone, or if you watched the video of it with the slides, you'll recognize a lot of what we've discussed in this episode as being, what was discussed very briefly during that presentation. Now, we're trying to couch these things together. I'm trying to build a cogent timeline that we can see these pressures slowly building up. And this is where we see more pressures. I mean, we have the land ownership. We have the Missourians chasing the Mormons out in 1833 and settling in Far West. We have Rigdon and Joe calling for the remuneration that the Mormons did not like. We have them giving the Salt Sermon and the 4th of July oration, which the Missourians really, really hated. And then we also have land values to put in here. We have, with the Mormons settling in 1831 and being chased out in 1833 so that they can't fulfill their 2-year obligation to the government. We see that happening all over the place, and the Mormons were doing it back to the Missourians. Let's not make any bones about that. This was a two-way street. It wasn't just the Missourians who were beating on the Mormons. It was constant conflict between an unstoppable force and an immovable object. I mean, it's absolutely insane. But now we also come to more land problems, land speculation. And John and I discussed this a little bit during his episode, but when people were settling in new towns, they didn't know if where they were buying property was going to be the new, the new Kirtland, a huge central hub of trade and commerce, or, Chicago, I guess, or Rochester, or any of these larger cities that would, become well cultivated and property values would skyrocket because people would move in like crazy. Or they might just get something like Hiram, or, like one of these dinky little towns that just cropped up and then eventually went away because there wasn't really anything there. Now, people speculated on the land based on where they thought people were going to buy and settle. You'd have a person that would buy a huge swath of land, or, chunks of land, and then break it up into smaller settlements and then sell it to a small subsect of people and say, hey, move out here, move all your friends out here. I'll give you a good deal on the property. And then, of course, the property value will increase as more people move out here. But if it ends up being a ghost town, then that's a lost investment. You bought a big swath of land that nobody wants, and it's valueless, essentially. So the question of land speculation, I guess you could call it an art of land speculation at the time, was very unknown. It was still not known what would be the central hubs of trade and commerce. Well, John and I talked about DeWitt in Carroll County. And this is taking another passage out of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur. Quote, "Trouble between the Mormons and Missourians began in Carroll County, not as an immediate result of the excitement caused by Sidney Rigdon's 4th of July oration, but because Carroll settlers objected to the Mormon settlement at DeWitt. When David Thomas and Henry Root, both Carroll citizens, invited the Saints to settle there, they informed Joseph Smith that they had been consulted on this business by others. Carroll citizens, however, claimed they did not discover that the lots had been sold to Mormons until after the sale. The citizens of this sparsely settled county, who numbered about 1,800, immediately protested with John Murdoch and George Hinkle, Mormon leaders from Far West, moved with their families to DeWitt in early July." Now, this is scary stuff, because the people in DeWitt, there were, a small number of people living there at the time. And these guys, Henry Root and David Thomas, sold a bunch of property to Mormons in DeWitt. Now, DeWitt, up until this point, wasn't much of anything. It was right on the Missouri River, so that was nice, because it was not that far from Jackson County and from Richmond and from these larger cities that were central hubs. But of course, it was up the river, and it was, not very big. It wasn't really that important of a town. But the Mormons bought it and said, this could be a big town. This could be an amazing settlement where we have direct access, right down the river to Zion. Now, we can control what trade is seen up and down the Missouri River and what flows in and out of Jackson County. Now, the Missourians, of course, knowing that the Mormons were buying up land in DeWitt in Carroll County here, thought, well, hang on. The Mormons are buying up this property. They're going to control that river. We don't like them. They don't like us. What the fuck does that mean? Where does that leave us? Where are we going to get our shit if the Mormons start seizing all of it from trade on this river? What happens then? So, a number of questions were cropping up that were causing people to become very scared of the Mormons. And of course, they began moving into Carroll County at the beginning of July, just after this 4th of July oration was given by Rigdon saying that we will kill the Missourians that come against us. It will be a war of extermination. Man, all of these pressures coming together is terrifying. I can't imagine being a believing Mormon living through this time, having the Missourians constantly pressuring the Mormons to not be where they are or to settle in a different area. If they can't settle in Caldwell, then they'll settle in Clay. If they can't settle in Clay, they'll settle in Daviess County. If they can't settle in Daviess, they'll move out to Carroll County. John Hamer and I did talk about this. Like, when Whitmers and Double Up Phelps and all the Cowdung were out running the church in Missouri, especially Double Up Phelps and the Whitmers, they had an agreement set out with the Missourians that will settle in Caldwell and Daviess counties, in Liberty and in Far West, and those will be our towns. Those will be the Mormon towns, the Mormon counties, essentially. We won't bother you. You don't bother us. We're good. And I think John just described it as like a handshake agreement or like a gentleman's agreement, right? Well, this wasn't good enough for Joe, because when Joe came in, he excised the members of the church that had that agreement. So suddenly the people that were in Jackson County and other counties in Missouri that were not friendly to the Whitmers, or not friendly to the Mormons, but had this agreement with the Whitmers and Doubled Up Phelps, they're like, oh, well, those guys are gone. And Joe and this crazy Rigdon bastard are in here talking about exterminating the Missourians. And now they're moving out and settling other cities. Now they're buying up land in other counties. They're violating our agreement, our gentleman's agreement. So that was another pressure that was pushing on the Mormons and the Mormon leadership that the Missourians really didn't like the Mormons for. Now, at the end of 1837, we had what was organized the Brother of Gideon Society. And it was, at the end of 1836, beginning of 37, when the church was organized, when the Kirtland Safety Society was organized, they also organized the Brother of Gideon Society, essentially at the same time, which were the archetype for the Daughters of Zion, which were referred to as the Danites. I'm going to read a little passage out of Ebenezer Robinson's autobiography again. And he discusses what was one of the final main pressures that caused tension between the Missourians and the Mormons. Quote, after having gone through with the form of a trial by the High Council, in which the cases of David and John Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, William Wines Phelps, and Lyman E. Johnson were disposed of, and Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon had written that unfeeling letter to John Whitmer, unbecoming of gentlemen, much less professed saints, and after having that remarkable revelation stating that Far West was holy ground, a society was organized by the church members, at first called the Daughter of Zion, afterwards Danites, or from which came the secret order called Danites, to be governed by the following purported Bill of Rights and Articles of Organization. Now, this is the title of that article. It's Bill of Rights of the Daughters of Zion and Articles of Organization. And then he lists out the entire Articles of Organization of the Danites. Now, I don't want to get into them because that'll be another 2 hours of talking about them, but the Danites were essentially the extra legal force for Joseph. Now, we've heard reference to the Danites. I've mentioned them quite a few times in the show, This is the time when the Danites actually begin to exert influence and become an important piece of this puzzle. This is from page 46 of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. Quote, "One other point deserves mention. Beginning in early September, the Missourians wrote letters to Governor Boggs," that's Lilburn Boggs, "and printed articles in local newspapers describing the militant nature of the Danite band. The existence of the Danites became so well known that non-Mormon settlers asked Mormons questions about the secret society. It is difficult to believe that Joseph Smith and other Mormon leaders knew little about the Danites when the group's teachings and activities were common knowledge and a chief source of anxiety among the citizens of northwestern Missouri." End quote. There's no way we can understand this from our perspective. Let's go back to that analogy from earlier. Let's say this Abu al-Bashida guy, or whatever I said his name was, is leading this, this commune of 3,000 or 4,000 people, and then claims that he has a militia, his own mob of 1,000, let's say 1,000 armed men are ready to enforce the will of this religious sect, of this, let's call it a religious cult. Now, let's say Abu had set up this Islamic caliphate essentially in Iowa, Kansas, wherever, and, people had taken notice, but they didn't want to say or do anything because they, Abu and his people weren't really breaking any laws, particularly. They're just, not white, and they just don't have American names, and they don't worship the Christian God. You can't march on them. You can't bring an armed mob up against them. You can't rein any of their leaders in for tyranny or for treason if they just do that. They're only exercising their religious freedom, their right to speech, their right to practice any religion that they choose, or none. But as soon as Abu stands up on the stand and says, this is what we have planned, these are the people that we will kill if they come upon us, it will be a war of extermination, we will follow them to their families and to their houses and kill them and spill every drop of their blood. And Abu has a 1,000 man strong army, armed with all kinds of guns, grenades, who knows what. The cutting edge of technology at the time were cartridge guns at the time, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, they were just converting from good old shot black powder guns to actual cartridge guns. And I would assume that if they were doing that some of these men had them. So, what's the pinnacle of armament technology that typical people can own today? Let's just say every one of these 1,000 men had Armalite AR-15s, fully loaded with holographic sights and portable grenade launchers and all kinds of really scary, intense stuff. Stuff that we only see in video games or in the armed services, if any of us serve. What if these 1,000 men are armed with all of that? They are marching around in uniform and practicing drills and target practicing. More than 1,000 men or more than 2,000 men that are ready to march and fight at a moment's notice. There's no way to understand what this was like. We can't put ourselves there. We can't understand what it must have felt like to be the Missourians watching this Mormon cancer growing in Missouri and slowly engulfing more and more counties and becoming weaponized and militarized, ready to fight or kill anybody that opposes them. And the scariest part is the Danites, They weren't just this idle type of amorphous shadow agency that was meant to just scare you. They were used. The Danites were employed by Joe and Rigdon in order to sway their own political leanings, in order to cause certain things to be done that they thought should be done. Of course, I can't talk about those now because we'll have to go into those next episode. Maybe that's what the next historical episode will be, is just, we're going to begin with reading about the Danites, founding the Danites, the Articles of Organization, and then talk about exactly how this weapon was used in the hands of Joe and Rigdon in order to cause political strife. It's endlessly fascinating. You know, I'm looking back on this time, I can't help but think Joe and Rigdon were fucking idiots when it came to running a church. I mean, there are so many great ways to run a church that don't involve amassing an army and giving a speech that says, I'll kill everybody who comes against me. Like, that's not the way to run a church. It's the way to run an insurrection, you know, an actual militaristic uprising. I mean, that many changes in political spheres were brought about by one man or woman saying things just like Sidney Rigdon had done with an army of 1,000 or less people behind them. I mean, many political changes that have happened throughout all of human history have been waged with nothing more than what Joe and Rigdon had in their pocket already. But it was so flashy. It was a grandiose way of doing things. If you're going to incite riot and persecution and people fighting publicly in the streets, this was the way to do it. Rigdon and Joe did an amazing job of creating this facade of being a pariah to the Missourians, to the native Missourians living in the area. And the Mormons, just being refugees there, were not seen as hostile until Joe and Rigdon made some of these certain steps towards militarizing these people, towards organizing the Danites and using them, towards giving speeches saying that we'll kill all the Missourians that come against us. I mean, it's a great way to make headlines. It's a great way for people to take notice, to stand up and take notice and think about the Mormons and what Joe and Rigdon are doing. But it's not the way to get actual things done, because the more energy and fire that Joe and Rigdon were adding into the system, the more frustration and energy it was giving back out to them. I mean, it was this positive feedback loop of crazy, of escalation, of intensity, and viciousness that didn't let up. The only way that it was solved was by locking these people up, by throwing them in prison for a few months. I mean, that's the only way. Like, this did not de-escalate at any point. There was no point that we could step back and say, it's a good thing that Governor Blank did this, that Governor Carlin or Boggs or, Joe or Rigdon or anybody in a leadership position or Brigham Young. There's no point we can say they did that and that's a good thing because it de-escalated the situation. It stopped the armies from marching against each other. No point in all of this history did that happen. It only became worse every day. It only became more self-destructive and stupid and downright absurd as the days passed. Nothing got fucking better from here. Things only became worse. For everybody. Whether you were just a typical Mormon living, breathing under the yoke of Joe and Rigdon, being protected by the Danites, whether you're just a typical Missourian, whether you were in the leadership of the Missourian government or the Mormon church, every single person was affected by what happens here. Now, we have a lot more to talk about in Missouri before we actually get to the standoff that led to Liberty Jail. That will happen in a couple of episodes, because there's still a lot more to discuss. Still so much going on. We still have to talk about the foundation of the Danites and who they are, what they are, and how they were used. But all of this together just shows us that, nobody knew what they were doing. The church had its time of being the firebrand crazy cult that people would forcibly persecute. I mean, Mormons were tarred and feathered and beaten in the streets and shot at and whipped because the leadership of the church. They had their firebrand phase. They had their coming out of their own mold phase. We have them falling into their proper way of lying phase in, the early 1900s as Utah was gaining statehood. And the twins of barbarism, polygamy and slavery were outlawed. And they stopped practicing polygamy. The church was hitting its PR-friendly stride at that point. Which makes me think about what the church does today. They're so goddamn smart now. They already had their phase of the persecution and the fighting and the armies that are marching against other militias. They had their time in the spotlight of doing that, and nothing good came of it. Now the church decides to move with money instead of with armed people, instead of with mobs. The dollar is more powerful than the bullet. Public opinion is more important than what you can get one or two firebrand parishioners to do for you. Moderation wins out every time over zealotry. And the church knows that. They're fucking brilliant at it. I mean, we've seen in just the past few years very small political moves that the church is engaged in. Political or monetary, either way, really. The two are so tightly interwoven, they're basically synonymous at this point. But we've seen their moves when it comes to acquiring new land or building new church houses and new temples in places that don't fucking need these massive white Victorian Gothic almost looking buildings that don't serve any purpose but for people to do rituals in and say passwords and secret handshakes. It's the only reason why those fucking things exist, but the church still puts them up at an incredibly alarming rate because they're smart about it this time. Far West was dedicated as a holy land. They were going to build a temple there, but they didn't live in Far West long enough to do it. They went the firebrand way. They went the fuck you, we're doing whatever we want kind of way, and they were squashed. Over and over again. I mean, the Mormons could not win with going the crazy way. So they decided to go the way that could win. And we see Brigham Young creating the foundation of that by moving the saints out to a place where there is no policing. Nobody can keep him in check. Nobody can balance his power. He's the undisputed king of Zion. And as that happens, I mean, Brigham Young runs into a fair amount of mob and militia violence as well, but he handles it much smarter, and he moves on from that. And he continues doing things in a much more businessman perspective, much more of a business mind to it, as opposed to a religious firebrand or a religious zealot. And Brigham Young was necessary in order to keep the church going. At the end of the Rigdon presentation that I gave at Sunstone, I gave a quote by Wycliffe Rigdon. Wycliffe, of course, was Sidney Rigdon's son. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, I can find no fault with the church doing what it did and following Brigham Young. because my father was in no state to lead a church. He was crazed by sickness and mental health disorders. He had a bilious temperament, which means he was usually sick, usually vomiting, and unable to even leave the house, probably from malaria, and a bit of his manic depression as well. And every time that Rigdon tried to run a church for any extended period of time, it usually collapsed on him, or shit changed, like Joe coming in, and then things are completely different forever. I mean, Rigdon never really ran a church by himself as his own Rigdonite church for longer than a few years successfully. He was not a fit leader. Brigham Young was. Brigham Young was the leader. And we can look at like maybe the Strangite church today or something, one of the churches that follows more of a prophetic bend, one that claims that they have the one true revelation. And they are much smaller. They are a subsect of, less than 1,000 people at this time that would claim themselves as part of the Strangite Mormonism. But you have somebody like Brigham Young that comes in and runs this shit like a boss, like a businessman. Well, we see what the church is today. We still see the vestiges of the Brigham Church in the LDS Brighamite Church today. Brigham didn't run it like a church. He ran it like a goddamn business. And that's how the church is run today. And that's how they really get shit done. By throwing around money and politicians and judges and public officials. Throwing around people and money and influence in ways that don't ever involve a gun or an army or a fiery sermon from the pulpit. Everything that the church does now is all behind closed doors. We don't see any of it. I say the church here as like this amorphous, demonic entity in and of itself, but it probably doesn't operate with as much solidarity and direction as I'm trying to vilify it with right now. But that being said, we still see the church operating in political and monetary spheres that it shouldn't belong in. I mean, why the fuck does a church need a $5 billion shopping mall? Why does it need a multiple $100 million amusement park in fucking Hawaii? Why does it need another multi-billion dollar shopping mall in fucking Florida? Why does the church need so much of what is not church related? It doesn't. It just has it. It doesn't need any of those things. It doesn't need any of the thousands of subsidiary companies that operate under the umbrella of the corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The church doesn't need any of that shit. But it has all of it. And when it has all of that, it has more power and influence on all of those things. So while we see on the very face of Rigdon and Joe in 1838 that they were villains, they were opposed to the status quo of the Missourians. They were the enemy. They were that crazy religious guy that just decides to do whatever he wants and say that it's in the name of God. They do the same thing today, but they just don't broadcast it from the pulpit. They just don't say we're going to kill everybody that opposes us from the pulpit. They don't say any of this. They don't act this way anymore. They act with money and power. And I would argue that every single time that a corporation or a single entity decides to act with its dollar, as opposed to using its members with guns in their hand, I think that's a lot more terrifying. When there's a standing mob of a few thousand people with guns in their hands, you know who your goddamn enemy is. But when nearly every elected official in Utah is a believing Mormon, when most judges are, when most most people walking along the streets in Utah are all members of the church. They don't realize that they're small pieces of this massive entity that exerts influence through them. The church is so smart today. It's so smart. And it's more terrifying now, I would say, because we no longer have that mob, that standing mob of people with guns that we can call enemies or that we can say are in the wrong. Now it's like, who does the church influence? Who do they exert their influence on? And how is it done? It's all in the shadows. It's all behind closed doors, and none of us see it today. So take whatever church you want. We can have a church like the Joe and Rigdon Mormonism, that if they were acting the way that they acted in 1838 today, they would be surrounded by tanks and, flown over with drones constantly, and they would have all kinds of public opposition. There'd be probably, various militias that form outside that are not part of the military, that stand there armed waiting for some kind of big battle to break out. Any of these, like these 3%ers or sovereign citizens or whatever that you could picture being at one of these standoffs. Do we want that church where there's a clear line in the sand, who's doing what, what's going on, and why we're scared of them? Or is it better to just be constantly chasing a ghost and yelling at a multi-billion-dollar entity that doesn't seem to give a shit what anybody says about them? It just exerts its influence and does whatever it wants just because they have the money and power to do it. I mean, really, who is a better enemy? If you have to pick one of these enemies, which one is better? I don't know. I don't even know how to answer my own question. Which one is really better? Obviously, we see which one gets more shit done. One gets the leadership thrown in jail. The other one gets the leadership multi-million-dollar houses in downtown Salt Lake. I mean, the church is smart enough to see which one is more effective. Hopefully we are too. Would you prefer to get a letter that reads like this? To Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, William Mines Phelps, and Lyman E. Johnson, greetings. There are no threats from you, no fear of losing our lives by you, or anything you can say or do will restrain us. For out of the country you shall go, and no power shall save you. You shall have 3 days after you receive this our communication to you, including 24 hours in each day, for you to depart with your families peaceably, which you may do undisturbed by any person. But in that time, if you do not depart, we will use the means in our power to cause you to depart. For go you shall. We will have no more promises to reform as you have already made, and in every instance violated your promise and regarded not the covenant which you have made. You put both it and us at defiance. We have solemnly warned you, and that in the most determined manner, that if you did not cease the course of wanton abuse of the citizens of this country, that vengeance would overtake you sooner or later. And that when it did come, it would be as furious as the mountain torrent and as terrible as the beating tempest. But you have affected to despise our warnings and to pass them off with a sneer, a grin, or a threat, and still pursued your former course. Vengeance sleeps not, neither doth it slumber. And unless you heed us this time and attend to our request, it will overtake you at an hour when you do not expect it, and in a day when you do not look for it. And for you there shall be no escape, for there is but one decree for you, which is, depart, depart, or else a more fatal calamity shall befall you. End quote. Do we want the church issuing that kind of rhetoric to dissenters? Or do we want them to just excommunicate us? Fuck, I don't even know how to answer that question. I'm so conflicted. And I guess it's not that simple, right? It's not like it's an either or. It's not like the church either has to act this way in violence and vengeance and warning people to depart or a fatal calamity will befall them, or it has to operate as this shadow, demonic, evil entity that doesn't, this amorphous being that moves and sways people according to its will. I guess it doesn't have to be either or, really, does it? I mean, the church is made up of the people that attend it. I mean, even the crusty old fuckers that run the 15 offices at the highest level, I mean, even those guys, they are still believing members in this church. I'm sure that many of them have read this stuff before and know what I would be talking about here. And I don't think that acting in this way is necessarily out of the realm of possibility for the church today. They just find so much more success in acting the way that they do, in running these through, having the same type of idea in a letter and then running it through a team of attorneys to have it, changed into proper legal speak. I mean, they get a lot more done now. And the church wouldn't be what it is today if not for their current business model. And I guess I'm most excited about what the next few episodes hold with Brigham Young, because we want to talk about the Danites and what happened with Liberty Jail and Joe and Rigdon being locked up, because that creates a vacuum that Brigham Young can step into and manipulate to be the office that he wants it to be. The Quorum of the 12 essentially rises to be the leader in the absence of Joe and Rigdon. Rightfully so. That's what Joe put the Quorum of the 12 into place for, to run the church in his absence. And that's when Brigham Young becomes bloody motherfucking Brigham. That's when he becomes the leader that the 1847 pioneer troop needed to lead them to Utah. I'm so excited for this. I just fucking love Mormon history so much. It's so good. This stuff is much better than fiction. You cannot make this shit up. And I'm glad that I've had access to people like John Hamer and Lindsay Park, who are able to shed light on these situations and help inform me on what I'm studying here. I'm reading about these situations across multiple books, and I'm starting to piece things together, but just to sit down and talk with somebody that knows how all of this played out to put this into context, I think is so incredibly helpful. And it helped me a lot. And it helps to offer a sense of direction through which this podcast will wade through this wasteland of historical confusion and competing narratives. And I'm elated. I'm stoked about the next few episodes, because this is an intense time in Mormon history. And not just Mormon history. We're approaching the Missouri Mormon War, the Battle of Crooked River. We're talking about things that actually have an impact on the greater history of the American continent. And that's the most exciting part of it. Like the people that experience this, we're reading the firsthand accounts from people like Ebenezer Robinson in this episode that actually experienced that. Or actually here during this time to feel what we are reading about, to understand what it was like to be living in Carroll County when mobs were marching on the town and threatening the Mormons with violence. It's sad that we can't put our minds there now. We can't see what it was like, but we can use these accounts to offer some level of insight, slanted as they may be. It's still amazing. It's wonderful to read through these accounts. Oh, the Danites. I just reading another passage on them here. The Danites are amazing. I cannot wait to start to get into them, because that's when Lyman Wight and George Robinson and Porter Rockwell and a few people really come into their own. So be watching out for that next episode, the Danites. And, you know, some people say that the Danites exist today as a shadow society. I don't know where they're getting that from, or what they're using as a basis for that, or even if it's possible, but I've heard people say it. Maybe we'll jump into that someday. Seems absurd, right? We will never know. And that is it for the historical portion of this week's episode. Need to thank a few new patrons who signed up to support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. First, we have new NAMO juvenile delinquent Katrina and Christopher. Thank you both very much. Also, we have a new NAMO adolescent rebel, Dean. Dean and Christopher and Katrina, thank you all very much for supporting the show, and patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Your support is very deeply appreciated. And really, to all of the patrons who support the show. Now, I don't do this, I don't think ever really, but there are some people, of course, that have either been patrons for a long time or have been pledging a certain amount that has made it so that their lifetime pledge has been a lot. And all of these people, I just want to thank directly so much. To all of you, I guess we can call you the movers and the shakers. Many of you have been signed up from the very early ages of this podcast, and the amount of support that you have given to allow this to become what it is incredibly appreciated. But me offering thanks and appreciation at the end of an episode, that's, you know, it's only in response to the kindness that all of these people have exhibited. And, I mean, it seems so lacking in a certain respect. And what I want to do to try and thank all of the supporters of the show is by trying to make it better. Now, that's hard to say, because on a scale, a spectrum of better or worse, a podcast is, you know, it changes from episode to episode. Oh, this was a good episode. Oh, this episode was utter shit. So it's really hard to make the podcast itself better or worse in a certain respect, because it fluctuates so violently from one end of the spectrum to the other every episode. And even sometimes in the episode, oh, that was a good part of it. Oh, the rest of the episode sucked. But I mean, you know, that one quote was really cool, but I don't want to necessarily make the show better. I want to make my ability to communicate better. And I think that's probably the most important point. Because this podcast began as a project, as a hobby of me learning Mormon history and sharing it, because I love the truth of it. I love learning about this stuff. I love being able to understand the history in a little more context. And I feel like so many people don't, and that's just terrifying. I want to spread knowledge as much as possible, and that was kind of the impetus behind the podcast, but it's evolved into so much more now. I want to become the best possible Mormon history communicator that I can be. And why am I doing that? Well, because I talk to people about Mormon history frequently. And oftentimes I feel like I'm just talking and talking and talking. The person on the other side of the conversation isn't listening. And that's a failing in my own ability to communicate. Now, if I'm going to communicate Mormon history, I need to be able to do it effectively and well. And the only way to do that is by practicing. Now, I've recently had an idea occur, and it's come from a fair amount of self-reflection and trying to understand the direction this is going. And what I mean is, I have a bit of a personal failing when it comes to communicating Mormonism and Mormon history in a face-to-face type of setting. I mean, I talk into a microphone, into a computer screen once a week, and I am able to communicate my thoughts that way, but that's nothing like a conversation, and that's where I think, personally, I have a bit of failings, and maybe some of you can relate on this. You know, I have conversations with TBMs on occasion, and it's fun to have these conversations, but it feels like there's this wall of knowledge that neither of us can really breach very well. And maybe some of you have had the same reaction. I get to a point where it feels like I'm just talking at the person, and it's, they've put up a defensive wall and nothing is getting through. We're no longer having a conversation. And that's something that is very challenging for anybody to do, I think. And I feel like I struggle with it especially. But if my entire career is built on communicating Mormon history, I have to be able to communicate that. But it's not just necessarily the career. It's that this is an important life skill that affects my relationships with everybody. And maybe some of you can relate to this as well. Being able to articulate thoughts and important Mormon history in a non-antagonistic way, I think is a fantastic resource that's underutilized when we may talk to our loved ones that are on the other side of the belief spectrum. Oftentimes the entire subject is just so taboo, it's hard to even broach and start, breaking the ice to get into the discussion. So, us having as much, knowledge of Mormon history as we have, it's kind of hard to get to the point where that knowledge actually becomes useful in a conversation with a loved one. And maybe this is something that I'm wanting to strengthen in myself, personal communication skills. And it's something that we can all benefit from if we are all able to increase our ability to communicate Mormon history with another individual, So this is kind of the idea that's coming forward out of this. If people are interested in it, patrons especially, I'm hoping to get some feedback on this. I would love to set up maybe like a Google Hangout or something where we can get together, get on the line, and sit and talk about Mormon history and ways that it is beneficial or ways that are detrimental to conversation. It's important to think about what we want out of the conversation as we go into it. Do I want to just get mad at this person, or is it better to actually have an open, honest, intellectual discussion with this person? What do I want? And there are different communication techniques to get different outcomes out of those conversations. So maybe that's something that would benefit everybody that chooses to participate in this. And, hoping to have a little bit of feedback on this. If this is something people are interested in doing, please let me know. Please get in touch, nakedmormonism@gmail.com. And if that's something that turns out to be successful and people like it and we feel like it's something we want to perpetuate, we did really derive benefit out of it, then, maybe we could turn it into like a monthly hangout or something like that. It can be a goal of some sort. But beyond that, I've had other thoughts occur. Maybe it might be beneficial to go sit outside of the institute building at campuses or something like that with, a camera and a microphone. And maybe, it would be possible to get some people that are coming in and out of the institute building to engage in a conversation about Mormon history. That could be really fun and compelling and, beneficial in learning how to properly communicate these broader historical topics to people that need to know this, especially believing Mormons that need to know this information. I mean, I want to spread it as much as possible, and what better way to do that than by talking to Mormons face to face? So I'm looking for some possible advice that people might have to give on those, or on other possible ways that we can exercise our communication ability that will hopefully make it so we're more capable of engaging in meaningful discussions about Mormon history, as opposed to just, talking at each other, talking at people about it. Who knows? But this is all I'm kind of throwing it out there, seeing what sticks. I would love to hear some feedback on it. So let me know what you think. nakedmormonism@gmail.com. But all of that being said, I don't want that to minimize the impact and the contributions that everybody has made to the show, whether it is contributing an email voice, some listener correspondence, whether it's contributing on patreon.com or through PayPal or, monetary donations, or just listening, even just listening to the show. You all make this possible. I couldn't do this without all of you, because you are the best listeners ever. Simple as that. And I would be willing to contend with any other podcaster about that anytime. That being said, I really do appreciate all of you so very much. Next episode is going to be a discussion episode with Lindsay Hansen Park of Feminist Mormon Housewives podcast. Under the umbrella of Feminist Mormon Housewives. Of course, she did Year of Polygamy, and she's working with Color of Heaven podcast as well. And she is an amazing history communicator and works tightly with the Sunstone Symposium. An amazing person, and I really look forward to the conversation with her next week. And we'll also do a listener mail segment on that episode. Had to do Patreon appreciation this one. Next episode we'll do listener mail, and hopefully we'll get in some more correspondence on that. Also, I'll discuss what happened with the Sidney Rigdon episode on Facebook next episode, because there has been a little bit of discussion about the presentation I gave at Sunstone, from people that are calling Rigdon a zero and basically a piece of shit. And I take serious dramatic issue with that, with every one of them. So if I remember, we'll talk about that next episode as well. I really hope so. But need to close down this episode for tonight. It has been a long one, but hopefully you've hung in there for all of it. First off, start off by thanking Demonista for running the Facebook page. Thanks so much for putting up stuff on there. I also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show with his permission. For his blog, you can go to weirdmormonshit.com. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing the artwork that's used in the show with his permission. You can go to his music by following aloststateofmind.com, where you can download all of his albums for free or donate to the man. He makes amazing music. If you'd like to leave a voicemail and have it played on the show talking about your story or talking about something that happened in your life recently, or even just something I fucked up on the show, that's 864-625-3366 or 864-NAKED-MO. Thanks to all of you who write in or share email correspondence on nakedmormonism@gmail.com. Thank you all to the patrons who support the show, who make this a full-time endeavor and allow me to research the deep Mormon history and bring it to you in podcast form. You guys are all amazing. But most of all, I need to thank all of you incredibly marvelous listeners for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast was a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.